racism in sports. Hello, Professor. Welcome.
Hello, Gabriel. I'm glad to be with you once more.
Indeed, indeed. So, is there racism in sports?
There is.
Okay.
It's a simple answer.
Yes, of course. How does it take place?
It manifests in all kinds of different ways, and it's been part of sports makeup for many decades now. But I don't believe there is one single, simple answer to why it exists. And I'm stealing your questions from you because I know that's what you're going to ask me soon. And that is why there is such a thing as racism in what is, after all, one of the most culturally diverse pursuits in history. I mean, sport brings together the population of the entire planet and unifies them, we should expect in any case, into teams or conferences or leagues or various other kinds of organizations. And so if you and I were drawing up a blueprint of a type of activity that will bring people together and to harmonize their common interests and enable them to share something that's joyous and rewarding and gives them great gratification, then we would probably come up with something quite similar to sporting competition. And yet we have almost the opposite effect.
Give us some example, because I mean, of course, racism is there in many institutions, but it seems to me, if you don't agree with me, please feel free to make your case as well. But it seems to me that sometimes the word racism is also overstretched, and that people may see racism where there really is not. So to get that out of the way, please give us some specific examples of how racism today in 2020 takes place in sports.
Okay, but first I want to agree with you. I do accept that the term racism has become elastic and has been stretched so far that I think it's led us into a position where nobody quite knows what is and isn't racism. Let me try now to address your specific points because you wanted concrete answers. There is what many people do call institutional racism in some sports. And that means that no particular individual, performer, competitor, organizer, administrator, manager is responsible. Every single person in the sport is free of racism, and they have no motivation to discriminate against any particular group at all. And so they may be the most liberal-hearted people imaginable, but institutional racism exists over and above individuals. And the example I have in mind is, and it's a very obvious one, and I think most of our viewers will probably be reading my mind at the moment. In British soccer, football, let's call it, because that's what the rest of the world outside the United States calls it, football, there is what many identify as a problem of racism in the hiring of managers at senior level. Managers of football clubs tend to be white. There are exceptions, but they tend to be white. And critics have said that this is an example, an illustration of why there is institutional racism in football. Now, if you interviewed every single person in football, the teams, the managers, the people who own the football clubs, the organizers of the leagues, they will probably say there's absolutely no trace of discrimination. And yet, and we could probably prove them right. We could probably test them and find out that they're all telling the truth. And yet, the fact remains that there are overwhelmingly white people in management positions. Why aren't there any, why are there so few black managers? And critics will say, because of institutional racism. So that would be an example of one type of racism in a particular sport. The same problem, almost exactly the same problem, existed in the NFL National Football League in the United States several years ago. And they addressed it by the Rooney Rule. We'll come on to that later, Gabriel, if we may, because I know you want concrete examples to begin with. So, and we'll talk about how we engage with those problems later. So that's one example. Another might be, and let's stay with football for the time being, is that when a black player appears on the field of play in certain parts of the world, particularly Eastern Europe, then they will be barracked. In other words, they will be heckled, shouted at, abused vocally by the fans, who will call them racial slurs. And they don't do it so much now, but they have been known in the past to bombard the players with bananas, as if to say, you're really monkey-like. They're extremely hurtful and abusive gestures, spoken gestures and physical gestures. And that would be a more obvious example of direct racism. In other words, this is not institutional racism where nobody can be held personally responsible, because you can point directly to specific people in the crowd who have uttered the remarks or made the gestures or thrown the bananas or whatever. So there will be two examples from the same sport. We have seen it expressed in different ways in amongst players, for example, not just in football, but we've seen. I do think we have to focus a little bit on football as well as other events. But there have been examples when players have shunned other players or spoken to them in disparaging ways. I'm thinking of the AFL, the Australian Football League, where this type of thing has occurred. And I suppose another manifestation would be when someone in authority, a person, a boss, an owner of a club, expresses attitudes and opinions that tend to put down his or her black colleagues. And that has been known as well, of course. So I'm trying to think of actual concrete examples of how racism is manifested. And these are happening now. These are not historical examples, but they're happening here and now.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm sure our listeners will not have any issue with your argument regarding throwing the bananas, because we've all seen that, and that's clearly racism. But I want to challenge you a little bit, if I may, with the first argument you made, because you're appealing to disparities, right? And you're saying, well, if so-and-so is the percentage of, let's say, blacks in the UK, how come the percentage of black coaches is lower, right? Now, whenever I present this argument, the typical response that I get from people is, why are you focusing on management? Why are you not focusing on players? If you focus on players, it's the other way around. So you mentioned the NFL and the Romney Rule that we can discuss later on. Yeah, but when it comes to players, in the NFL, it's about 60% black. And in the US, the black population is only 12%. Is that evidence of racism against whites? So why doesn't it go both ways? Why are you focusing on management as evidence of racism against blacks? And why are you not focusing on players as evidence of racism against whites?
Let me try and rephrase. I'm going to come at this exact same question, except from a different angle. And this was something that was expressed to me during a piece of research I was involved with a few years ago. And someone said to me, yes, there is a disparity. There is a disproportionately, there are disproportionately fewer managers and senior coaches if you compare the population with the population of black players in football. But if you compare with the general population, it's actually quite an accurate reflection. In other words, black people are obviously a minority in British society, a significant minority, but a minority nevertheless. And you could look at this in two ways, simply saying, well, there are a minority of black managers, and that accurately reflects the surrounding population. But there is there are an awful lot of players who are black. So if the population you're comparing it with is the playing population, then you would think logically there are too few black managers. It depends on how you want to tackle the subject. Most people assume that because there is enthusiasm and a very deep involvement in football amongst black people, that the number of players who wish to go into management are a great many, but they just can't get the jobs. Again, I'm trying to throw alternatives as much as possible. But another way of looking at this would be maybe they've got their head screwed on and they think that this is one of the most unstable careers out there. And the average tenure of a manager is about 13 months nowadays. So what on earth would I want to go into an occupational sphere where my chances of holding a job for more than 2 years are infinitesimal? But of course, if you land on your feet and get the right jobs, the Mourinho type jobs, where you, when you're negotiating your contract, you say, well, okay, the first thing I want to know is how many million do I get to spend on transfers? Because, I could use an immediate 70 million to bring four new players into the team. So if you get into that kind of gig, then obviously management is very prosperous and glamorous, and it's the kind of job you want to be in. If, on the other hand, I know I won't cite any examples, but I imagine that 85% of people in football management now are living precariously and wondering, how long they're going to be in a job for. You could say that this is actually quite a rational decision to stay out of soccer.
Right.
It really, this is the kind of question that it really, whether there is or there isn't a problem depends on how you approach it.
Right. Well, for the sake of argument, let's move on and let's assume that there is racism indeed. All right. And
okay.
of the way that, of the kind you mentioned, both the kind of throwing bananas to the field.
Conscious racism.
Right. I mean, that's obviously there, throwing bananas and making monkey sounds, but also the kind of institutional racism that you referred to. Now, let me get something to what you said at the beginning, which I think it was very interesting. You're saying of all activities that human beings do, this looks like the one that's the fairest. And I remember, well, I don't remember it because I wasn't alive back then, but reading through the history, when you take a look at the case of Jackie Robinson, for instance, the first black player in baseball, the argument is frequently made that it was eventually managers came to realize that they could not win baseball games without black players, and that it was competition itself that broke the color barrier in U.S. baseball, right? Now, I wonder, how come that doesn't apply to the rest of sports? If I'm a manager and I know that a black player is good, I'm going to make that player play because I want to win. And, the irrationality of racism should not come and take over my decisions, because if the ultimate goal is to win, then I'm going to put into play the best players. If I'm a fan and I want the team of my city to win, I don't care if the striker who scores a goal, what color of skin it will be, as long as he scores goals, because that's the bottom line, winning. I mean, that's what the fan cares about. So how come this irrationality of racism steps in an activity that is seemingly so rational because it's all about winning? How did irrationality step in?
It is now, but in Robinson's day, and for the first half and then some of the 20th century, the social arrangements of the United States and perhaps elsewhere in the world, but particularly in the United States, prohibited black players playing with whites. It's as simple as that. So it didn't matter if you were saw the most outstanding baseball player or football player or boxer. Boxing is a bit of an exception, but maybe we could talk about that later. It doesn't matter if you identified someone that they were outstandingly good, the most gifted player you'd ever seen. You wanted them on your team. The social arrangements just would not permit you to do so. So that, there are greater things in sport. Sport may be close to a meritocracy, but whole societies have a way of overwhelming that. And so the way society was organized in the United States simply did not permit Jackie Robinson playing with a white team. But of course, he persevered and ultimately did so. And once he broke the so-called color bar, then it permitted other players to follow likewise. But today, the kind of scenario that you've outlined, I think, is close to the reality. I can't imagine that any coach or manager or trainer or anybody who selects teams would not do it purely on merit, because he or she is out to get the result. And sport itself has changed, of course. Sport in the early 20th century was different to sport as it is today. It is a much more cutthroat business today. Win at all costs, simply because, and you don't need to be a genius to figure this out, there is a lot of money in sport nowadays that wasn't around for most of the 20th century. And when you have very high stakes, people will do whatever it takes to win, because win means more money. And so it clearly would make no rational sense at all to exclude your best players because they happen to be members of a group that either you personally didn't like or you felt would jeopardize, or let me try and think of this way, antagonize your own fans. So, for example, if I was a basketball coach in the late 1980s and I saw a player, Michael Jordan, and I thought to myself, well, yeah, he's a great player, but he's an African-American. So if I play him in my team, I'm probably going to antagonize all my fans, and then I probably will get the television executives breathing down my throat and saying, there are already too many black players in this league, so what do you want to pick this guy, Jordan? That didn't happen, of course, Gabriel. That's ridiculous. It's nonsense, because at that point in the 1980s, the game had diversified, not just that game, but all sports had diversified to the point where they were meritocratic. In other words, you selected players because they could play ball, or they could run fast, or they could fight, whatever. And of course, anybody looking at Jordan back then, he was a standout player, so you would have picked him. It was the only logical thing to do. No one even had a second thought about but they would have in the 1940s. You see, someone might have looked at Jordan and thought, well, we're going to piss everybody off if we select a black guy, so we better not do so. And so these kind of barriers that existed in the early 20th century were removed, gradually removed, admittedly, but they were removed. So by the time we got to the 1980s, racism really wasn't that much of a factor. Now, I say not that much of a factor, but it still is a factor. And I think that is the bedeviling problem that we all have to try and figure out, those of us who think seriously and as deeply as we can about issues such as this in sport, is why has this, after so many years, why has this remained such a stubborn problem? in an activity, which, as I said earlier, is one of the most culturally diverse imaginable. You've
And
got
fair
people from all over the world who love sport. Why should there be such a thing as racism?
right, and not only diverse, but also allegedly meritocratic, as you're saying,
Yeah,
right? So it doesn't
yeah.
really make. Okay, so what's your answer for that? I mean, why do we have racism in sports?
Well, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to this. I don't, in the same way as I think scholars who say I have a theory of racism, this is why it exists, or I have a model that I believe in. I think that they are kidding themselves. I don't, I'm a sociologist by trade, as you know, and that makes me aware that there are changing social contexts and things that we feel are stable and continuous are on closer examination not. They're unstable and discontinuous. And I think racism is one of them. So, for example, I think we have one term, one word, racism, and we think it's the same thing now as it was in the 1950s and before, and that's the same thing that existed in the late 19th century, and so on and so forth. I think that is patent nonsense. I think we have to understand phenomena on their particularities, the way they fit into time and space. So it's convenient for us to talk about racism and when we analyze it, and it's also convenient for us to compare similarities in the way people have been excluded, deterred, and discriminated against. And think, well, yeah, that's the same kind of thing that was happening in the late 19th century. So there are comparisons, but I think the reasons are different. So, I mean, and I imagine, I could stand next to a colleague now, imaginary colleague here, a black scholar, who will remind me that black people have been on the receiving end of mistreatment, rejection, exploitation, or sometimes downright oppression for the last 400 years. That's continuous, he or she would tell me. And I accept that. But of course, we have to also understand how the patterns of discrimination have changed over the decades. Now, so we have continuities and ruptures when we look at racism. And what we're trying to discern is, what are those continuities? We know there are ruptures in the way societies change, but why does this residual, this kind of anachronism, we'll call it, it seems to be from another time in history. Why has this endured for not just decades, but for centuries? And this, I think, is the most incredible problem that we have when it comes to sport, because you would, as I said earlier, if we were drawing up a blueprint, you would say that sport is a way to combat, not encourage racism, but actually to attack it, to undermine it and destroy it by bringing people together. And yet we have this perplexing paradox of racism emerging in unexpected ways in activities where it really shouldn't be. Now, let me just say one further thing here. The evidence that I have closest familiarity with is when I was a young man. I used to go to football I'm obviously a sports fan, as you know, but I used to go to football as a young man in England. And I witnessed firsthand, every time a black player come on the field, they were abused. And it wasn't just occasionally, it was every single time. And so then I was tasked in later years in trying to explain this. And I think it is just about intelligible. It doesn't make it any less repugnant, but it's intelligible in terms of this. The game of association football was invented by white men to be played by white men, to be run by white men for the gratification of white fans, mostly male. So it was a white institution in every facet. And it remained like that for decade after decade after decade until it came to the late 1970s, when the sons of migrants who'd traveled to Britain in the post-war period from the Caribbean, who'd grown up cheek by jowl with white kids who kicked balls in the school playground and played for the school teams, and then went on to play football for a local club. And they were brought up, they were socialized in that kind of environment, and so quite predictably had a similar enthusiasm for football and were good at it. And started making the grade at the senior levels and getting jobs as professional footballers. And so they started appearing in teams. The white fans, and they weren't just predominantly white, they were exclusively white back then, in the late 70s, early 80s, resented this. Their attitude was, this is our game. This is a game for white men, and okay, we know that there are black people who live amongst us now, but they're not really part of football. So there was this kind of animosity that grew amongst white fans, and it disappeared eventually. When I say eventually, it disappeared. I mean, it hung on in 70s, 80s, but by the time we got to the 90s, people got used to the idea that black players were constituent parts of football, and two, then had to get used to the idea that stupendously glamorous and talented players who were black were coming from all over the world to play in England's Premier League in the early 1990s, because there's so much more money here, of course, than elsewhere in the world. And so the likes of Patrick Vieira and Ruud Gullit, these are world-class players. So it just didn't make any kind of sense to abuse players or to try to insult them when they were so much better than most other players on the field of play. So racism didn't tend to, but did disappear. It just wasn't in evidence whatsoever at that point in history. Now, here's the question. Did it go away? Did it just sort of die a natural death? Or was it simply ignored by the media? In other words, did it just sort of rumble on, except it wasn't noticed so much? I think probably I thought the former. I thought it had disappeared, but really I wasn't looking hard enough, nor was anybody else for that matter. I think the residue of racism, let's put it that way, still existed, but players didn't report it. Now, here we go off into a different tangent, because we have to ask ourselves the question, why not? Now, I've spoken to several black players in recent years who are contemporaries of mine who played back then, and they said there was a code of silence, effectively. In other words, coaches said, if you grumble about, racism and being called names, or getting stick off, stick is what footballers say for abuse from other players, you will get a bad name for yourself, and you'll find it difficult to to progress in this sport. And so they kept it to themselves. They didn't report it. And maybe I don't have any time machine for going back and checking out the facts of this, but it does make sense to me. If you kick up a fuss and you get a bad name for yourself as a troublemaker, then you may find it difficult to get another job at another club, or you might find yourself out of contract, something like that. So I can buy this idea that there was a code of silence and there was racism. I think that really ended, I guess, a few, 6 or 7 years ago, when Patrice Evra the black player who is French and was familiar with a different environment to the Premier League, and he felt he'd been insulted by Luis Suarez, and the Suarez was, of course, cited as a racist. He insisted he wasn't, but he was. And I think that lifted the kind of lid, if you like, if you can call it that, Gabriel. I think other players then said, you know, Evra's right. We've been keeping silent on this unnecessarily. Maybe we should start reporting it. So I think we have a scenario now in which the racism that you talked about as a kind of an elastic band has been stretched and stretched and stretched to the point where almost any insult nowadays is immediately interpreted as racism.
As you probably know, my cultural background is similar to Suarez because he's from Uruguay, I'm from Venezuela, right? So we're from the same continent. And I remember when this incident happened, lots of people were saying in Spanish-speaking countries, but you know, these are terms of endearment because he called him negrito, which means like little black, right?
I know. I remember his explanation.
Right, and that's what he explained. And to us, to the Spanish-speaking people, it sounded reasonable because in Latin America, in everyday life, we do call each other those names. And apparently, I mean, I'm not under that skin because my skin is not dark, but apparently black people in Latin America do not care about these names. Now, I mean, they may actually suffer and keep also a code of silence, but I wonder if there are different codes in Europe and South America that are interpreted differently. Because you've been speaking, for instance, saying, well, black players made it through after the 70s and so on. But as you were saying that, in my mind, I was thinking of Pele, and Pele was around long before the 70s. I mean, by 58, he was already famous, and you know, he was a world champion, and he was beloved by everyone. And as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a historian of soccer, you know about this much more than I do, but as far as I know, Pele didn't really complain, not even now, about racism that he ever suffered in Brazil or other countries. Right, so my point here is, might there be an exaggeration of this because of the new wave?
There might be.
Yeah, and especially European and North American sensitivity might be different from South American or Asian or Middle Eastern sensitivity.
Well, let me complicate it even further. I'm going to agree with you. Yes, I do think there are cultural sensitivities that are not good for all the world, you know, and they shift from continent to continent, but also even within within the same culture. So, for example, if another black player had spoken in a similar way, it may not have been interpreted as an insult. I mean, we see this in Quentin Tarantino movies all the time, and our viewers will know the kind of thing I'm talking about. That when one black person addresses another, a different kind of cultural code of acceptability is rendered operational. But if a white person engages and uses the same phrases, then that's declared inoperational, and that person is immediately chastised because of it. So, but just growing up in this world, we learn when to say things and when not to say that, and we know when one group can appropriately engage with certain types of language, and when another group, well, for the most part, in any case, I'm sure that there have been mishaps. In fact, I know there have been mishaps, and people will say, well, you know, I use, when a white person will say, I use that term, but I hear it in the movies, and I hear black people, and, you know, I listen to hip hop, and they use it all the time. So why can't I use it? Well, when you grow up, you do figure out that there are just unspoken rules, and the fact remains you can't, and so you don't, unless you want deliberately to be abusive, of course, which is a different thing entirely. So there are different sensitivities, not simply across continents, but within continents and within particular cultures. And I don't think that there's a rule book that you can refer to on this. You're just growing up in that kind of environment. Suarez obviously hadn't become attuned to the sensitivities. quite in a nuanced way, let's say. But I just think growing up in those kind of environments, you kind of just acquire it. You know, you don't learn, you do learn it, but I mean, you don't learn it in any kind of formal method. You know, I can remember, as we're talking about this, when the word black could have been construed as an insult. And to call someone black, you know, I grew up in the 50s and 60s when you didn't call people black. This is something that really came into being in the 1970s, largely in the United States, but then spread throughout the world. You know, James Brown say black, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, kind of thing. Yeah. You know, that became an anthem. And the word black, of course, was appropriated and fused with a new positive meaning. And I mean, it's a brilliant kind of inversion of an insult. And other words have had the same kind of, not so much inversion, I think is the word I'm looking for, you know, turned inside out, in other words, and given a completely new meaning. And these things just happen. These are just cultural processes. But it seems in sport, they don't quite always get it right, and they use words inappropriately. I remember, I don't know if you remember, I got to know this guy quite well, and I love the character, Hector Camacho, the boxer.
Yeah. Of course, Macho Camacho.
That's Macho Camacho. Fabulous character, and I interviewed him several years ago. He was just unforgettable, really unforgettable. But he made this error. You know, he grew up with black fighters, trained with black fighters, and fought, you know, black rivals in the ring. But he did put his foot in his mouth on one occasion, I remember, and used the word inappropriately, and he was roundly condemned for it. And you thought, well, this is a guy that's grown up in these kind of environments where he should really have figured out that he, as a Latino guy, was not allowed to use these words in the same way as an African American. But so you've got to be pretty, what we English would call, clued up all the time about these things.
Right. You said at the beginning that for you, it strikes you as a paradox to say, well, how can sports, being so multicultural and so on, how can racism persist? Let me challenge that a little bit, because it seems to me that it will never go away. Because if there is an activity that arouses tribal feelings, it's sports itself. I mean, take a look at the World Cup. I mean, do people really care about 22 people chasing a ball? Or is it more about waving the flag and, you know, supporting your country at all costs, even if your country is not so good at soccer? I mean, that's when nationalism becomes exacerbated to the point of stupidity in World Cups, right? Now, and obviously this nationalism, I suppose it can bring good out of many people, but if history is any guide, it will also bring a lot of bad things, right? And World War I, World War II, it's all about nationalism. So if we have an activity in which it's pretty much a reenactment of war, not with the weapons, but you know, you have the outer aggression, and some people may say it's catharsis and so on. Don't you find it natural that these kind of things would happen? And to go back to the example of Camacho, let me finish and and you can reply. To go back to the example of Camacho, I mean, in a sport of boxing, aren't you supposed to bring out your inner animal in order to succeed? So it becomes almost natural that you engage with this type of racial slurs?
No, you're not. I mean, in boxing, that's the worst thing you can do. One thing your coaches always tell you, you got to stay in control. You know, you've got to be organized. The worst thing you can do in boxing is lose your temper and just go at someone ferociously, because you're going to get picked off. A good boxer will pick you off. So one of the first rules in boxing, in particular, is to stay in control and, you know, keep to your plan, kind of thing, and don't be put off by your opponent. I think that's pretty much the same in any sport, you know, Gabriel. I can't imagine that. I'm just trying to think quickly if there is any sport in which really losing your temper and getting angry and just losing it and become, as you say, naturally aggressive really helps. And I don't think it does. I mean, certainly it wouldn't in tennis, would it?
No, no.
So, running on a track or, technique is much more important. Obviously, you need to be motivated,
Right.
but technique will always win out in any sport. So no, it doesn't make any sense to have. You've got to sense rivalry, obviously, because that's what competition is about. Rivalry. You're trying to outdo your opponent or out opponents in the plural. But I don't think there's any kind of natural reason why a person should. I mean, you fall into the trap, a racist trap, if you're going to say that there's anything natural about racism. There isn't. It's a completely unnatural activity. It's a thought process. It begins as a thought process, and thought processes don't just pop into our head out of a vacuum. They're put there by the way we're brought up. Our upbringing in schools, in our families, in our peer group, in our engagements with the media and with politics and with our church. All these things bear influences on shaping us, not shaping us only in a physical sense, but in a mental sense, shaping the way we think. And so when we think in racist terms, this isn't because we've sat down and figured it out for ourselves, nor is it because it's a natural impulse over which we have no control. It is something that's put there.
Right, but okay, I get that part, and obviously, just because you're aggressive in a particular sport, that will not make you a racist. I mean, I see
it
your
doesn't
point.
necessarily make you aggressive.
Yes,
I've seen people who are, demons when they step into a boxing ring, and they step outside. They're the nicest guys you could ever wish to meet. They walk into a pub, someone could spill a drink over them, and they would say, "Oh, sorry, mate."
Absolutely. I think of Evander Holyfield, for instance. He was a
a
gentleman,
complete
a
gentleman.
complete gentleman, right? No, but do you acknowledge that some sports, and football in particular, arouse these tribal feelings and in events?
Amongst fans, not amongst players. I mean, there is a tribalism, but that again, I'm going to interrupt your train of thought again. Tribalism is not natural. This is, again, something that emerges in the way we grow up. We're not born into a tribe, and have a tribal mentality. This is something that we acquire when we grow up, and we learn these things. It's part of our education, not in a formal sense, but what sociologists call socialization. We are influenced. The greatest influence on any of us is a group, our peer group, or the people we work with or go to school with, or our extended family. These are the greatest influences in our early life. And then as we grow up, obviously, we're still, even at my age, I'm still being influenced by what I read and hear and see on TV and in the media generally. We're being reshaped all the time. And we can't escape this, because that's what makes us human. If we're brought up in isolation, we cease to be human beings.
Some psychologists evermore now say that we may have some genes for tribalism. I mean, this is what evolutionary psychology has been saying for a very long time.
Yeah.
I suppose you disagree with that.
Oh, oh boy, do I disagree with that. All right. Yeah. Pretty much anything that's evolutionary psychologists tell us we have in our genes, I would dispute, because that's for the simple-minded. I just think it shows laziness, intellectual laziness. Because my feeling is that when you say, "Oh, well, that's in our genes," it means you haven't explored every other possibility. And I think that you need to be exhaustive. When we're trying to analyze, trying to explain the reason why something exists, then you look for all avenues. You have to try and figure out what are all the influences that bear on us. And if you really can't find anything at all, then you say, well, it must be in our genes. And to me, that is, I haven't found anything yet in all my years as a scholar that can't be figured out with enough deep thinking about social, historical, and cultural factors. And that eventually you just have to be thrown back on the old gene theory. No, not for me.
Okay.
And in any case, Gabriel, it's a pretty dangerous thing, because if you're saying, for example, we're talking about racism today, if you're saying that this is something to do with our genetic makeup, what do you do about it?
Yeah. Well,
So
of
you
course,
just
of
remind
course.
yourself, well, it's part of our genetic makeup, so we do nothing. It's patent nonsense as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. But I want to be a little fair to the evolutionary psychologists who say this. I mean, I'm only playing devil's advocate here, but let me make a point on their behalf, because they
All
do
right.
make it all the time. They say, well, I mean, it may be in our genes, but it's not our prison. We can't come out of it. That's the
Well,
first thing.
that's true. I mean, I'm not denying the fact that we are gene machines. That's what we're made of. There's flesh, blood, tissue. It's all genetic matter. I'm not doing even the brain cells. It's all genetic matter. I can't possibly. I'm not stupid enough to deny that. But I'm just questioning how much explanatory potential there is in genetic theory, as opposed to social theory.
Indeed. All right. Yes, that's a fair point. Okay, so we have racism. We're not so sure what causes it, but you've provided
Well,
a few
I'm not
factors.
sure, no, but I mean, I'll take a stab at that, because I think where racism does appear, and in different guises, as I said earlier, and probably you have to look at each individual context historically to try to understand with any precision what occasion, the conditions, let's put it this way, the conditions under which racism becomes a reality. But a common condition is competition, not sporting competition, but competition over scarce resources in society. Now, those scarce resources: housing, prestigious jobs, money, authority, status. There are things, good education for our children, material goods. We are all in competition over scarce resources. That isn't genetic. That's just because we are human creatures and we wish to survive. And these equip us better to survive. So I think what we seem to see is that where there is competition over scarce resources, and that intensifies, then we look for physical markers or as to why some groups are our rivals or enemies or opposition, shall we say. In other words, they're not our friends any longer. Again, let me throw my own experiences. I'm a baby boomer, which meant I was born in the post-war period, and as I say, grew up in the 50s and 60s. And initially, after the war, Britain experienced a period of migration from the Caribbean and from South Asian countries. And there was no such thing as racism. People will tell you differently. They say, oh, well, there was racism about in those early days. But the term itself wasn't in use. People used, I mean, I can't remember this far, but, I'm a bit of a study of archival films and old documentaries and stuff like this. But racial discrimination was used and prejudice was used, but not the term racism. That came later. Now, initially, while there were plenty of jobs about in the UK in that period, and this was a time where anybody could just walk into an industry and get a job, because there were underpopulated. So there's plenty of work about and plenty of money about, and people were relatively affluent in the post-war period. And what happened is, as the 50s crept in, as we approached the 1960s, then unemployment started to appear, and it became more difficult for people to get a job. And so that's what I'm talking about, scarce resources. A job is a scarce resource if there aren't that many jobs available. And I think that what happened, well, it's not I think, but from my understanding of history, is that whites started looking around. They thought, well, I've been fired from my job and I'm having a problem getting another job. But I'm looking around me now. What's changed? I see many more Black people or Asian people than were around before the war. Maybe the reason I'm having difficulty getting the job is because they're getting the jobs. So you had this kind of competition over the scarce resource. Now, that's just one illustration where you can have what you might call an easy on the intellect explanation. And that explanation would be, if they weren't here, then I'd have my job back. I mean, ridiculous, of course, simple-mindedness in its extreme form, but that's what racism is. I mean, racism isn't that sophisticated, remember. In fact, that's the whole point of racism. It's easy to understand because it's so crude. So you make the equation between your own well-being and your absence of well-being and the presence of people you don't want here. How do you recognize them? Well, they look different. Look, the texture of their hair is different. The skin color is different. They wear different clothes. They listen to different music. They eat different food. These kind of things. And that's how racism begins to come together, the complex into a complex whole where they fit together. And then the stereotype emerges. And once that stereotype emerges, it becomes a hell of a job to dislodge it from people's mentalities, which leads me all the way back to one of the original questions that we started with about why something as nonsensical and as harmful as racism endures for so many years. And that is because I think that stereotype does have a way of fastening onto people's mentalities. And the way it fastens is, it's a terrible metaphor, the fasten. It gets into people's minds. And then when it gets into people's minds, remember what I was saying earlier about how we learn experiences, or we learn how to experience things. These are not inborn, they're not genetic, they don't just fly into our heads. If you, and I'm not suggesting for 1 second that you do think like that, but I'll just say you in a kind of a generic sense. If you have these kind of thought patterns and you accept that stereotypes about other groups that have historically been designated races, I'll use the word in inverted commas races because there's no such thing really, of course. And then you teach your children the same thing, then that kid will grow up uncritically accepting that there is such a thing as a stereotype. And this is a serviceable way of understanding other groups. Doesn't matter if you're friendly with them or if you share the next desk to them at school, you can still hold that stereotype and then invoke it when the occasion merits it. And of course, the occasion that merits it is this competition that I talked about earlier. So that's as near as I can get, I think, to a theory that holds good for all occasions. And I know our viewers are probably going to think, well, that's implausible because it doesn't work on every single occasion. Well, of course it doesn't. But I do think if you're charged with the task of trying to explain why this attempt to push some groups out and to and why you continually feel antagonistically towards them, why this obtains generation after generation, then I can only say that the circumstances change, but not sufficiently to dislodge these kind of stereotypes. And I still think there are people out there, and we're talking to each other from different continents, of course, but I do think in both our continents and beyond, there are people who still harbor these kind of stereotypes, and they're extremely injurious. You know, they occasion injury on other groups. And that's as near as I can get to an all-encompassing generalization, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, I mean, I think your analysis is right on target, but I think there are some counterexamples, and I'd like you to address them. I mean, you're explaining why racism exists in society as a whole. Maybe I was more interested in getting an explanation from you regarding sports, because as you were explaining all this thing about scarcity of resources and competition, I was thinking of some of the countries that are closer to my environment. Think about Brazil, for instance. It is a racist country. There was slavery. There are racial slurs all around and so on. There is deep racism in society. But when it comes to soccer, apparently it's not there. You will not see Brazilian fans throw banana peels at black players. Actually, they may talk monstrous things about black players, but when it comes to someone like Pele or Neymar or Ronaldo or any of those great players who have dark skin, they draw the line and say, no, this is different. So, I mean, I can understand your explanation, and I think it's a very good one, of why there may be racism in society, but I don't think it takes us so far as to why there is racism in sport, because in a place like Brazil, there is obviously racism in society, but it doesn't cross the line to go into sports.
But I'm not going to disagree with you now, because I think you're right. And for that reason, I think that we do tend, and I'm not naive now, I haven't got my head buried in the sand, and I am aware that racism still does exist in sport. No question, I'm not denying that, but I do think we exaggerate its extent. The Brits in particular are constantly self-examining their football and saying, isn't it dreadful, you know, that racism still exists in football. It is nowhere near as intense or as widespread as it was. Nowhere near. It's not on the same page as it was in the 70s and 80s. And it's patently absurd of anybody to suggest a comparison. And of course, when I suggest this, people say, well, you know, that's just typical to, you know, you're denying. I'm not denying that it still exists. And I think you're probably going to agree with me, but I just feel that we have exaggerated its presence. Now, I'm not kidding myself. And I know if you go to Italy and some of the games there, you're going to find right-wing influences in every single game. You know, the ultras have made their presence felt and will continue to do so. But that's a particular kind of example. Another kind of example, let's look at to the Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe. I think, I don't want to get myself into trouble here, but my feeling is that they are undergoing a process similar to what the British were in the 1970s and 80s. In other words, they're seeing players emerge and they're surprised by them. And what they're doing is cottoning on to, as football fans do, any sports fans, to any characteristic that is conspicuous. So football fans are very unkind people. So if you're a Ukrainian and your opponents come from another part of Europe and they have black players, well, they will pick on those black players without fully comprehending just how serious racism is. I think that that's what's happening in Europe. And I know people will criticize me for saying this, but I just don't think Eastern Europeans have lived through the post-war period.
Right,
And
right.
because of that, have not experienced the intensity and the seriousness of racism and just how deep it goes into society. I think that they're probably thinking, well, if 3 or 4 of the players had red hair or were had big noses or something like that, we'd pick on them. Or were bald or something like that, we'd pick on that as well. So I think that they're picking on the black players, not because of any deep-seated prejudice, but because that's what football fans do. And I think in time they will be taught this isn't just like having a big nose or being bald. This is racism, and this is altogether more.
Yeah.
Don't want to diminish the importance of making fun of people who are bored, etc. but there is no there. I don't think there is a full grasp of how deep racism
I agree with you. I agree with
how
you.
tormenting it has been.
I don't think you'll get in trouble for this, for the simple reason that unlike the UK, the Ukraine, and let's say Russia or Belarus or Bulgaria, all the Eastern Bloc, right? They unlike the UK, they've been a racially homogeneous
Yes.
population for a much longer period. So they're not
used. As were the British.
Exactly, before the end of empire, right? Before the massive migration from Africa and the Caribbean.
Exactly.
So, it will take time, but I think eventually they will come to a point where, just like in the UK or France or now Portugal and Spain, they're becoming more racially aware.
I think that that's what will happen. I just don't have a time code on it, so I don't know when it'll happen. But in the immediate future, what do you do about it? Well, you punish them. I mean, you try and educate them, but education.
Right. So we've been speaking almost for an hour, but I don't want to leave without you telling us not only what lies ahead regarding racism and sports, but also what can be done. What's your recommendation? Now you're saying punishing who? Because whenever I hear this word, I say, are you going to punish 100,000 people that are in Santiago Bernabeu if only 10 of them threw peels or banana peels at the field? And let's say, because this has happened in Madrid, how is Real Madrid going to control 10 antisocials? I mean,
before I answer that question, and I'm not going to avoid it, I am going to answer that question. But I think one of the things that we have missed at today in today's conversation, and that is social media. And I think social media, again, I think we exaggerate this, but it's probably worth exaggerating, because one person or half dozen people, I mean, there may be a crowd of 40,000 football fans. If 6 of them have racist inclinations, then they can go on social media and have the same kind of presence of countless others, because of course these things can go viral and they can make hurtful and hugely insulting and abusive remarks. And in other words, social media amplifies racism. But I do think we should try and keep that in perspective and realize that given the number of people, the users out there of social media, the amount of racism and abusive messages that we see, relatively small, still unwanted and extremely unwelcome, and things that we should do our best to expunge from the world of social media. But I don't think the monster is as hideous as the media would have us believe. I think it's more like an insect that could be swatted rather than a life-threatening monster.
So this is overblown.
What do we do about punishing? Let me address this. What do we do about punishing? I just think there is this thing called rough justice, and it's imperfect, and it involves punishing innocent people. But I think that's what's got to happen. And I think what I would like and would encourage is the kind of punishment that would propel fans towards a self-policing. Let's say a football club, football fans at a London club are using abusive language or taunting a particular player, and it comes to the notice of officials, and they apprehend them, and they go through the whole process, and it goes all the way to UEFA. That's the European governing organization of football, and they have to decide what to do. And so they say, well, look, we believe that the club itself is responsible for the behavior of its own fans. And the club replies, well, hang on, we can't control every fan. We know that. But ultimately, somebody has to bear the burden of responsibility. And within our framework of rules, it is the club. So we have to punish the club. Well, that's rough justice. That isn't fair. But what do? Well, next season, you will not be allowed to play in European competition, whether the UEFA Champions League or the Europa League. What? That's dreadful, the club replies. The rest of the fans go mad. The media say that this is appalling. It is unfair in the most extreme way. But UEFA stick to their guns and say, that's what's going to happen. X club is excluded, disqualified for 1 year. Next time somebody hears at the club, next time somebody hears a racist remark, the whole crowd will turn around to them. Shut up! Remember what happened last time. You got us kicked out of Europe, people like you making remarks like that. So be quiet. That's what I mean by self-policing. I mean, rather less aggressively, or maybe more aggressively.
It might work, but how do you solve the
problem? I think then you create the conditions. You can't make people self-policing, but you create the conditions that permit people that kind of license. In other words, they would be inclined not to tolerate that kind of behavior because they know that their club will be punished. And if their club is punished, then that indirectly, or perhaps directly, punishes them.
Of course.
So I think this is a question of cracking the eggs to make the omelette. If you want something better, you've got to do damage early on, and that means cracking a few eggs. And that's what I mean by rough justice. It's unfair, but you're asking me what do we do about it? I don't have a perfect solution. I have a very imperfect one, and it's one that will upset a lot of people. And a lot of people might say it won't work in any case, but it's worth trying.
Sure. I see a problem, however, and I'd like you to tell me what solution you have to that problem.
All right.
If I'm a fan from, let's say, Manchester United, and it's playing against Chelsea, I would go to London. I would infiltrate the stadium wearing a Chelsea shirt. I would throw banana peels because I want Chelsea to be punished, even though I'm from Manchester. So that's the whole point. So how do you avoid these false flag operations, so to speak, from fans?
Well, you can't, is the simple answer. And the honest answer, you can't do much about that. If a Manchester United fan would dress up in a blue and white scarf, I think it's doubtful, in any case. A lot of them would not be seen.
For strategic
Manchester
purposes.
United fans would not be seen dead in blue. So that's the first practical problem.
Strategic purposes.
Yeah, well, I don't think even for strategic purposes. And I think that is a bridge too far. I think I would take my chances that no self-respecting Manchester United fan would don a blue shirt and deliberately travel 250 miles south to London and then start making and pay admission, which is not cheap at Chelsea anyway, and deliberately to cause trouble and probably risk getting arrested in any case.
Right.
So I think that that would be unlikely. The other thing, Gabriel, that I think I'd like to mention, because I think that this is underestimated, all the big clubs nowadays, all over the world, not just in the UK, but they all have big sponsors. Now, what you just reminded me, because one of Manchester United's big sponsors is Chevrolet. It's the car company. Their headquarters are in Detroit. Detroit in the United States is a city where I think something like 80% of the population is African Americans. So if Chevrolet get uneasy, shall we say, with the amount of racism that they think is going on, perhaps not just at the Manchester United club, they might be able to bring pressure to bear on Manchester United and say, look, we are an industry whose headquarters is in a part of the world where there are a lot of black people, and they are probably understandably going to be upset if they feel that we're putting our money into and there's a substantial amount of money that they pay in sponsorship to United, if they believe that we are encouraging, endorsing, and approving of a club where there is racism. There is, I'm not saying that there is at Manchester United, not far from it, but I'm just giving this as a kind of a illustration of what might happen. A sponsor could. So what are you going to do about it? I mean, you mentioned Chelsea earlier. Yokohama Tires, I think, is one of their big sponsors. What about if they went to Chelsea and said, what are you doing about it? And the Chelsea owner, Roman Abramovich, said, well, actually, nothing. What do you expect me to do? Well, we want something done because we don't want to spend money on sponsorship at a place that is not doing something active to combat racism. So, I mean, I think the sponsors could have a role to play. I'm not quite sure, I haven't sorted this out of my head, but I thought raised an interesting point. And when you asked me how we tackle these things, sponsors could be one approach.
Right, there could be pressure from various angles in order to make this problem go away. Professor Ellis, just one final point before we go, and we've been speaking for a full hour, but for me it's a pleasure.
Yeah, and we're losing our light in any case over here.
Right. Now, before you go, because I do want you to address it as quickly as you may, the issue about disparities, what's your solution to that? You mentioned the Romney rule, which is basically quotas for management.
I don't think it will work. Mm-hmm. In soccer, I can't see it working because there is less compliance. The NFL is an organization that exacts compliance from its member clubs, and we have a much more laissez-faire approach, probably because of historical reasons in football the world over. I think the owner of a club, if he or she wants to appoint a manager, they do so. And I don't think that they will be dictated to by any governing organization. So I think there will be an awful lot of resistance to a Rooney type rule. And in actual fact, there is a similar type of ruling that exists in the EFL, that is the strata just below the Premier League, and they just ignore it. And there's no punishment.
No teeth.
Just ignore it.
Yeah, a rule with no teeth, it doesn't work.
Exactly.
Right, yes.
Exactly. So I think that will be difficult to enforce over in Europe, in the world of football.
Well, Professor Ellis, Cashmore, this has been a very enlightening talk, and I look forward to talking to you about another topic once again.
My pleasure, Gabriel, and I've enjoyed it also. So we'll speak again in the near future. Goodbye.
Indeed. Goodbye. My pleasure.